This Sunday, November 27th at 2 p.m. at the Winnipeg Art Gallery, the Winnipeg Jazz Orchestra is putting on a concert called Back to the Future. What makes this concert so very special is that the WJO will be premiering a brand new co-composition written by two composers who definitely know how to write for big band. Composer and band leader and historian Fred Stride from Vancouver, and trombonist and composer Jean-Nicolas Trottier from Montreal. Joining me here over Zoom to talk about what promises to be a fantastic concert, I am joined by one of the composers of this new multi-movement composition, Fred Stride. Hi, Fred. It's nice to meet you here over Zoom.
Yeah, nice to meet you too, Chris.
Mhm. I want to first start out by talking about how the project came about. Can you talk about when you first received the commission from the WJO? And can you talk about how the partnership with Jean-Nicolas Trottier came about?
Uh, well, I was contacted by Richard Gillis. I've had a long relationship with the Winnipeg Jazz Orchestra going back, I think into the 90s, I think maybe the late end of the 90s, early certainly 2000. I think this would be my seventh time with the orchestra. So I can't remember the exact time, but it's got to be at least a year and a half ago.
Mhm.
I think it was during 2020. It might have been in the fall of 2020 when Richard phoned and kind of talked to me about what this might be. It could have been early 2021.
Mhm.
I don't remember anymore. I've moved on so
Yeah.
much. Um, and I know that they had done one with Dave Braid and Philippe Cote, that they had done one before. And I'm not sure if there's been one in between or not, but I know that those two fellows did a co thing. And he mentioned, and I got to say that I wasn't. It's kind of an odd thing, to write a piece of music with somebody else. It's like write a book with somebody else. It's
Yeah,
an
yeah.
odd request.
Uh-huh.
Um, but then he mentioned, that we were trying to put composers together from across the country. You can't
Mhm.
do it with somebody that I work with here in Vancouver. That no, we want you to get across. So he mentioned Jean-Nicolas and said, "Do you know him?" And I says, "Of course I do. Yes, I had met Jean-Nicolas back in 2011. I was in Montreal. I did a thing in Kingston, Toronto, and Montreal, and I did master classes at University of Montreal as well as McGill. And it was at University of Montreal that I met Jean-Nicolas, and
Uh,
he laid a disc on me, and it was a real quick, fun kind of meet, and we kind of have been aware of one another for ever since. And I think he certainly knew who I was, so he knew more about me than I did about him, which was so apparently he asked Richard if he because I guess Richard talked to him before he talked to me and said, if possible, can I do it with Fred? I was quite flattered. And so when
uh.
I knew it was Jean-Nicolas, I went, sure, yeah, okay, I'll do something with Jean-Nicolas or JN.
Perfect. The new composition, it's a multi-movement work called Connections.
Yep.
Can you talk about what the title means? I know Ellington and Thad Jones play a role in the work, as I understand it, and arrangers from the past. Can you talk about where the title comes from?
Well, the title, it was just something that just as you start working on things, like we had talked about, we had done one of these Zoom sessions, the two of us, and talked about what this was and kind of approaches because it's wide open. There was nothing that Richard said you have to do it this way, you have to do it. It was really wide open. So
Right.
he left it totally up to Jean-Nicolas and I. Um, as to how we do this. And when we talked, there are certain things we didn't want to do. One of the things we didn't want to do was, well, I write a little theme and you arrange it, or I'll write 8 bars, you write the next. That
Yeah.
that would not work.
Mhm.
It's like being an author. You write that paragraph and I'll write the next one. I mean,
Yeah.
that could be fun, but it was not what he and I wanted to do. So we were on board, totally understanding how each one of us wants to do this.
Mm.
I went first, and I wrote something that eventually became the sixth movement.
Mhm.
That was the very first thing that was written, and I had put something on it. And I thought, well, what are we doing here? Well, Richard's connecting us across the country like this. Uh, and I guess I was just, the others had other titles to play with. And I thought, well, Jean-Nicolas, let's call it Connections. And I
Mhm.
just called mine, just because it was the first one that was written, I just called it Connections 1. Now it's
Right.
6. And I sent that. And so when you write these days with the technology, you can write, they don't sound very good, but you can write these MIDI that comes in all these music notation programs we all work with these
Yeah,
days.
yeah, right, right,
And,
right.
and you can render that. And so I sent him the audio file. It's pretty crude, but he's such an astute musician. Yeah, he gets it. So he then wrote something in response to mine. He
Mhm.
called his, I think he called it Connections 2, because we were just going in order.
Yeah,
But then he
yeah.
put a subtitle on it, Sounds of Joy, which was the first one that he wrote. And
Mhm.
so not okay, now you damn guy. Now I have to come up with a subtitle. And I just thought Connections 1 through whatever we
Yeah,
were gonna
right,
do.
right.
I didn't even know how many of these we were gonna do. Um,
Mhm.
would be this kind of like a nice working title. It's very nondescript, other than
Right.
so we both came up with subtitles. He was much better at that than I was. And so that's where the connections, I think, in terms of past writers and those that we really admire, we're on pretty common ground uh, with some of these names. Some of them that we're going to play, but we certainly can't include everybody.
Right.
Um, for me, being a lot older, that just everything I've ever done or heard or anything has been an influence on me. Um, but I think you can make connections. It's a pretty loose one. It wasn't the intention. The connections title was more across the country. Kind of like, I remember doing some of my earliest things for Jazz Radio Canada on CBC, because they had the weekly show and you're hearing groups from Toronto and Edmonton and Vancouver and Halifax
Right,
and
right,
it
right.
was a great way, and that's how I learned about all the other great players and writers across the country when I was in my earliest 20s.
Hmm.
There's a connection. So but the connection you can certainly, it's easy to do to kind of connect what we do today to the past, because I've never been one to jettison the past. The past is really important for us today because
Yeah.
it shows us ways we can go about things, whether you choose to follow them or not. It really shows us something. So,
Yeah, I know. One of the things when I was preparing for the interview, one of the things that kept coming up and in regards to you, Fred, is you very often turn to the past. Guys like Hoagie Carmichael, Stan Kenton, all these guys. Um, what did you like? What do you take from looking to the past? Guys like Nat King Cole and such in your own arrangements.
well, for I guess nobody's ever asked me that one before. Um, I guess it's how to put it all together and make, be like going back and studying past films or novels of the past is just to how to tell a really good story. And
Yeah,
for me, in the medium that I spend a lot of time in, which is big band jazz,
yeah.
uh, whether it be more really adventurous, really modernistic, or in the past, it's I'm taking everything from there, like structurally how to put a piece of music together. But I gotta
Hmm.
say that structurally too, like the story, also comes out of listening to classical music too.
Hmm.
Like I discovered on YouTube the Los Angeles Philharmonic playing this piece by Ginastera that I never knew about, and I went, "Wow, what a really nice!" Of course, the orchestra is sensational,
Yeah, yeah,
but
right.
the piece of music was like, "Wow, I got it!" And so, not long before we logged on here, I'm watching the score on YouTube. People upload the score and it scans
Yeah,
along, and I
yeah,
went, "This is fantastic." So yeah, I would say that probably when somebody says, "Well, who amongst the past writers?" Early on for me, it would have been more Thad Jones and say Rob McConnell,
yeah. Hmm.
but always from day one, it was Bill Holman. Bill
Hmm.
Holman's not a household name outside in for the general public. But
Yeah.
those of us that write for big bands and everything, and he's now in his mid 90s and still with us. And I don't know how much writing he's doing these days. Probably not. Probably doing some, but not a lot.
Was a great sax player.
Oh yes, he was. And but the writing that he did for Kenton or Buddy Rich or Woody Herman, and especially his own bands, is stunning. His use of counterpoint. And I
Yeah.
guess when people hopefully come to see the concert on Sunday, that's one thing that they'll hear, this getting several lines going at once, like a
Mhm.
conversation in a way.
Is it going to be opened up for solos at all? Like I
Oh
know,
yes, yeah, yeah.
right?
These
Because
these are these are
yeah,
jazz things, yeah. So I know I've written
because I know
uh
Slide Hampton's a big influence on Jean-Nicolas, right?
particular, yeah, same with me too, but I think he looms bigger for Jean-Nicolas than myself. For me, it's Bill Holman looms bigger,
Mm,
and Bill Holman's less for Jean-Nicolas. But work Thad Jones for both of us.
yeah, yeah,
Those big, yeah, and this is not a new music concert where you go and it's like chamber stuff. It's big band music. There's a
yeah,
lot of swinging going on,
yeah, yeah,
and lengthy solos. They're not little 8-bar things like we would
yeah,
the band's doing in the past when they're
yeah.
limited by those
Playing a couple
378s.
choruses or whatever. Yeah, yeah,
Oh yeah, so when we write today, the structure of the music is not, I guess what you don't hear as much today in jazz composition are songs. Like, um, for instance, if we take somebody like Rob McConnell,
hmm
fantastic musician, just first class, worldwide first class kind of
yeah,
world class musician and writer player. He would, when he wrote original music, often he wrote a song.
yeah,
It
right.
was a tune and it had that kind of structure and harmony to it. Then he would arrange them in his inimitable, fantastic way that he would do it.
hmm
But it would be all totally original. But he would approach his own songs like Harold Arlen or Hoagy Carmichael or who else he was arranging. Um, Thad Jones a little bit in that way as well. They're much older and coming out of that tradition.
hmm
Those of us that write today, probably my generation and certainly the ones younger, are coming out of it with a, a real foot in classical music, in that we don't, to do jazz, you don't have to have a song.
Right.
You can spin out your story. You can have this thematic material that's not too, as we would say, boop and beep, you know, too abstract. No, you're not going to hear any of that in the concert.
Mhm.
But you're coming from that, and you're developing your themes and your motives, which is very much like akin to a classical composer. What we add to the mix is a rhythm section. So we have drummers and piano players and bass players and guitar players, and then you have people. You give a place for people to improvise as well. So there's in every movement there are these lengthy solos, along
Mhm.
with a lot of ensemble playing. So I know that the rehearsals are going to be intense and long. So there's a lot of music.
How many different movements is connections, and how was the work divided up? Did you like say, for example, did you write four and John Nicola wrote four? Like how many
Well,
movements
yeah,
are
we ended up at 8. We had no idea how many of these we would do. We ended up at 8. There was a time limit, 45 minutes max. I think we went to 46 minutes. Hopefully Richard doesn't get too mad for 46 minutes.
yeah.
But like I say, I wrote one, and Jean-Nicolas and I had agreed we would kind of hit a sweet spot in the 7 or 8 minute mark.
hmm
And so we each wrote a movement. And so he wrote his first movement. He uses Morse code. And it's pretty abstract, and it's not like you're hearing da da, like
Yeah.
stuff my dad taught us when we were kids how to do Morse code. Um, uh, it's very long, drawn out kind of thing. But he's thinking that, and I went, I'd like to try that. So I
hmm
thought, well, well, Jean-Nicolas, I emailed, let's try writing a movement each that's maximum 2 minutes.
Mm.
And so I went first. I took his name and I added hello. So hello, Jean-Nicolas. And
Uh-huh.
I entered it in, I found a site online where you could enter in Morse code, words in Morse code,
Yeah.
and it would spew it back. And so I got that, I wrote it out, and then I just kind of looped that as this kind of ostinato, like a
Yeah.
repeating
Repeat it.
thing,
Yeah. Yeah.
throughout and using his name. So it's like I'm yelling at him. And of course, I wanted to, well, hello, Jean-Nicolas. Who solos on that? He does. So then he wrote one.
uh,
And so we just kind of went that way. Then we wrote another longer movement each, and it just kind of evolved into, by this point we're like two each. Well, okay, where do we go from here? So we're going
mm,
to write a longer one. Then we had even talked about trying to write one together, but with time constraints, both of us being very busy, both of us do some teaching. He does a lot more teaching than I do, and we both have outside of our little bit of teaching commitments, writing commitments,
right.
to projects. And so I'm always busy doing something with somebody. So it's time to move on. So we just wrote a couple of short things on our own. And he brought back not Morse code, but he he wrote what he sent to me. He says, "This is the final movement." I went, "Yeah, great," because I had said, "Well, why don't you write a final movement?" And he wrote this beautiful ballad kind of thing. It was really lovely.
Mm.
And and then about a week later, he sends me the total opposite of that. This very aggressive, somewhat dark thing. He says, "Fred, your name comes out as a blues lick." So so he starts using my name in his piece, and I went, well, I'm not going to let that. In the meantime, I had written what would be the seventh movement and the slow thing. So of course, I went back and rewrote my parts of my seventh movement, doing the same thing, using his name mostly and a bit my name as well. So we got this kind of calling to one another kind of stuff. So it was a lot of fun. I had a great time,
Are
you
there
know.
are there are there differences in orchestration between your stuff and Jean-Nicolas? Like, when it comes to the big band, are there significant differences between the two composers?
I would say that in hearing each movement, I don't think you would mistake one for the other. We're coming from the same places, so we have a tendency to write these big, powerful brass things, and we're not really writing sax solis like Benny Carter or
Yeah,
Thad
right.
Jones or anything like that in this piece. Not that either of us couldn't. I mean, the saxophones are prominent, but um, I would say that mine is probably more contrapuntal, maybe more detail oriented. I don't know. It's because I really like what he did, and
Mhm.
harmonically, his language is a little different than mine.
How
Uh,
so?
well, um, I would say if you kind of had to pin it down, it comes a little bit out of like maybe Wayne Shorter,
Mm.
with a touch of Kenny Wheeler. But he wrote a lovely one of the movements is just four trombones, no
Huh.
rhythm section. And it's got that chorale like thing that Kenny was so good at, and it's going to be beautiful when we hear that on Sunday. So yeah,
Mm.
his language is a little different. Still, both of us seem to want to swing above all. So everything is. I mean, there's a few eighth note, straight eighth note kinds of things, but there's a lot of swing going on.
And did the fact that you were writing this music for the WJO influence what you wrote, or was it just sort of they can do anything and just sort of?
I I think so. The only thing that I remember asking Richard was about where the solo strengths are.
Mm.
So if you're wanting to assign a soloist, you don't want to just put it in any old, like when Jean-Nicolas and I write for our own ensembles, we know exactly who's sitting there in
Right.
whatever chair they might be, and so you can assign the solos to those people because of the way they solo everything else. That's a very Ellingtonian kind of approach, and we still have learned a lot from that. So it might be, okay, it's the fifth trumpet player,
Right.
or it's the third trumpet player, or it's especially in the horns rhythm section, because some of the musicians I know, like Will Bonas, I know Larry Roy. I don't think I've worked with, but I certainly know him and I've met him.
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
Bass and drums, I don't think. I'm not sure if Rob Seawick is playing on this one or not. I don't have the whole list.
Yeah. I don't have the lineup either.
I
So
worked with
yeah.
Rob quite a bit in my visits there.
Mhm.
Very nice drummer. Very nice drummer. And nice fellow too. I quite like him. And I know that there's just so you know, there are two musicians living in Winnipeg now that have become big parts of the scene there that are from the West Coast.
Okay.
One is the new trumpet teacher at the university, John Challoner. I met
Huh.
John when John was in grade 9. He was in the music educators, the BCMEA,
Yeah. Yeah.
on a jazz band, and I was the director.
Ah,
That's how. But Andrew Littleford,
Letterford. Yeah. Yeah.
I've known Andrew, well, since he was born. His parents are two of my dearest friends,
Right.
and we were all at music school together, Jim and
And
Holly.
and Andrew's just released a new CD, his own
Yes, yes. He sent me
recording.
a link and I watched the CD release concert and it was
Yeah.
wonderful.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. It's great. Fred, this has just been an absolute blast talking to you today. The concert on Sunday with the WJO is, I'm sure, going to be great. Thanks for taking the time to talk to me about Connections. Looking forward to it.
My pleasure, Chris.